introduction so we stay on time. Thank you CBCHers and Roy Ballers for joining on. I'm really excited to present our guest speaker today, Sarah Garfinkel. She's Professor of Psychiatry and Neuroscience at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience within the University College of London, which she just joined in the middle of the pandemic, I think moving from Sussex, if I'm remembering correctly. I had the good fortune of meeting Sarah at an American Psychosomatic Society meeting probably 2 years ago when it was in person. And I just loved what she was presenting on. And really it was Don Edmondson who sort of turned me on to this idea of thinking about interoception in our patients in the first place. That's really made me think differently about a lot of my primary care patients that have a lot of somatic symptoms that are challenging to manage, and certainly relevant to a lot of the patients we're following in REACH and Roybal projects, where we're thinking about the emotional experience and how that's affecting the processing of symptoms of internal organs like chest pain, breathing symptoms that we're dealing with COVID patients. So a lot of interest in Sarah's work. She comes to us from a background in neuroscience, but also is really translational and thinking about some of the basic science, but also how it applies to interventions. So really a lot in common with our group. And yeah, with that, I'm going to pass the mic to Sarah. I'm going to keep track of questions. So if you have questions in real time, feel free to use the chat box. And there are enough of us, I think I'll try to save them more for the end. But Sarah's going to leave time for a good discussion. So please remember your questions as she goes along, and I look forward to that part of the talk as well. Okay, go ahead, Sarah.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak to you today. I'm so excited by the work that's coming out of your centre and how applied and interesting it is. And it really is a pleasure to be able to speak to you today. So I'm going to give you the talk, The Heart-Brain Axis in Clinical Neuroscience. So we're interested in how the brain and the body are intrinsically and dynamically coupled to influence our emotions. And when I first joined this field, I actually was based in America at the University of Michigan, where I was investigating how fear in the brain may lead to persistent fear memories and fear reactions in individuals with post-traumatic stress disorder. So I was working in Detroit with people with PTSD, and I was looking at this neural fear circuit. And I was interested in the role of context and how individuals with PTSD may not be able to use safety contexts. So I was putting people with PTSD in dangerous rooms and safe rooms, and I was looking at how external context could not serve as an external safety cue or context for individuals with PTSD. Fear memory still prevailed even in safe rooms. And it was during this work that I noticed in these PTSD patients that the brain wasn't the only story, that they had such interesting bodily profiles, that they would often be accompanied by symptoms of hyperarousal, racing heart, sympathetic activation. And it made me wonder what was happening in the so-called internal context in the body that could be interacting with the brain to also drive fear processing and fear memories. So, as I said, we know the brain and the body are intrinsically and dynamically coupled. Our thoughts, feelings, and perceptions can be guided by these internal bodily signals and their interaction with brain. And so when we think about the senses, we tend to think about vision, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. But actually, these can be classified as extraceptive senses. That is, they tell us something about the outside world. And we also have proprioception, which is a sense of the position of the body in space. And we have interoception, the sensing of internal bodily signals. And this is such an interesting field to be in terms of interoception, because it is a relatively new sense. So while our other senses have been known about for a long time, interoception was only differentiated from extraception by Sheridan in 1906, which is relatively recently. And actually the first formal definition of interoception was really only produced in 1948. And Sheridan defined it as the body-to-brain access of sensation concerning the state of the internal body and its visceral organs. But researchers still to this day can't decide on an exact definition of interoception, nor can we decide exactly what an interoceptive sensation is. So while Sheridan confined it to the visceral organs, others look at all internal signals. I personally lean towards the visceral definition myself. And also the way in which we define interoception is also expanding. So in order to try and reach some consensus, a white paper was written in 2018, which brought together around 100 interoception researchers, where we came up with a shared definition. So interoception refers to the process by which the nervous system senses, interprets, and integrates signals originating from within the body, providing a moment-by-moment mapping of the body's internal landscape across conscious and unconscious levels. And I was really happy with this definition, as it was really guided in part by my work, which looks at the conscious and unconscious processing of these bodily signals and how they might influence how we think and how we feel. So my work is most known for delineating different dimensions of interoception. So how can we study interoception comprehensively in different individuals? And I strongly argue that interoception is a multi-dimensional construct. And actually, we need to study it on all different levels as a means to derive interoceptive profiles for people, as a way of seeing how internal signals may, in different ways, shape cognitions and emotions. So my work and the work of others, which is very empirically focused, looks at measuring interoception in different ways across these different levels. For example, we measure the interoceptive afferent signal, so the afferent signal itself. We look at how this afferent signal can be expressed in the brain in different ways, thus the neural sensing of these internal bodily sensations. We can also look at how these bodily signals change stimulus processing. I have a lot of work looking at this, but this isn't a level I'm going to particularly talk about in this particular talk. We look at accuracy, that's the precision with which people can detect internal bodily sensations, and I'll talk a lot about that. There's also this subjective level. I call this interoceptive sensibility, inspired by a previous group, but basically it's a belief about how good people think they are at sensing bodily sensations. And then a really important point that I'm going to be talking about throughout this talk is that asking people how good you are isn't the same as testing how good they actually are. That there's this interesting discrepancy between interoceptive belief, how people think they're performing, and actual accuracy. As a side note, I think this derives a little bit from the nature of the interoceptive and exteroceptive systems, that our exteroceptive system has the capacity to be very much coupled to conscious awareness. You want to typically be able to know if you've seen something, smelt something, felt something, heard something. While this could happen outside the scope of attention, or it could happen just on the threshold of perceptibility, it's beneficial to be able to tap into that consciously, know you've seen something, know you've heard something most of the time. Whereas with the interoceptive system, our bodies are doing stuff all the time, and we don't necessarily want to be distracted by what's happening internally unless we have to be. So most of the interoceptive system is being processed just below conscious awareness, unless there's a problem, and then it's potentially more accessible. But this means that there's often a capacity for how good or what people think is happening in interoceptive system can be decoupled from actual interoceptive accuracy and precision. but I'll talk more about this and give examples from the clinical literature. And there's also these higher order metacognition and attribution elements as well, which I'll also touch on later from a clinical perspective. And it's my belief that these interoceptive dimensions need to comprehensively be studied in people. They are dissociable, and the degree to which they are dissociated also gets wider in clinical conditions. And I'm going to be talking about some of that today, and then how we might use these insights into deriving novel therapeutic approaches to help train people in terms of interoception measures as a means to change symptoms such as anxiety. So first of all, looking at how we measure some of these different processes. So my work especially focuses on the heart. And I mean, I don't need to tell you, you're all experts in this, but there are different cardiac measures that we can look at, such as heart rate variability. We can also look at moment by moment changes following a stimulus in terms of cardiac acceleration and deceleration rates, which also can change. So thus we can look at afferent signal in different ways. And we can also look at how the afferent signals are expressed in brain. Focusing now on a different interoceptive signal, the gastric signal. There's lovely work coming out of Paris, which looks at gastric signals and how they're coupled to changes in the brain. And through this, by looking at the stomach-brain synchrony, you can get insight into a resting state network in the brain coupled to changes in the gastric system. In terms of looking at cardiac signals and how they're expressed in brain, this can be done in a number of ways. One way is looking at EEG, where you can look at the heartbeat evoked potential, look at the amplitude of the signal, and see how that differs in different people as a neural measure of this cardiac afferent signal. And individuals who have altered emotion processing, such as those with borderline personality disorder, also known as emotional, oh gosh, I'm blanking on the name, they also, instability, they have a different HEP amplitude. We can also look at fMRI, so getting people to focus on the heart and compare that to their focus to an exteroceptive signal such as a tone. And when you look at this interoceptive focus on the heart relative to an exteroceptive stimulus, you get this classic interoceptive network in the brain of using a recent meta-analysis looking at cardiac interoceptive focus. You have the midline structure, but you also routinely get the insula as well as a key region. But interoceptive focus, just getting people to focus on the heart relative to focusing on an outside exteroceptive cue, isn't necessarily telling you whether people are actually accurate at detecting their heart. It's just telling you people are focusing on it. And we can also look at individual different measures in terms of how accurate people are at detecting their heart. So if I were to make you all do 100 star jumps, then afterwards you would probably feel your heart pounding. That cardiac signal is stronger and faster, and it's thus more easily able to be consciously perceived. But at rest, just sitting down right here, there would be a real individual difference in how accurate some people are relative to others at rest. And historically, people have used very simple cardiac tests as a means to derive insight into who is accurate and who is not accurate at rest. For example, the Chandri test just gets people to count their heartbeats in a specified time frame. And you can look at how accurate, how many they are by looking at how many heartbeats they report relative to how many they actually had. Or other tests look at playing tones in sync with each heartbeat or out of sync. And people have to say whether tones are in sync or out of sync with their hearts. And through that, you can also derive accuracy measures. This in sync, out of sync task is much harder. It's an internal, external integration task. People find this very difficult. There are a lot of new cardiac interoceptive tasks being formed at the moment. I'm editing a special issue that's about to come out in Biological Psychology, looking at interoception methods specifically from all different bodily axes. It's a fast-growing field, and we are constantly coming up with new and exciting measures. But these are the classic ones that have been used historically. And what we can see is that when we examine whether people are accurate or not using these different tests, and then correlate these interoceptive accuracy scores with neural activation in brain, then there's a correlation between insular activity and interoceptive cardiac accuracy. So the more the insula is active, specifically the right anterior insula, the better people are at these tasks. This also holds for grey matter volume in the insula as well. Again, the right anterior insula, where grey matter volume in this region also correlates with cardiac interoceptive accuracy. So now we have both a functional measure and a structural measure in the right anterior insula, which correlates with individual differences in terms of interoceptive accuracy. And individuals have tried to look at the relationship between emotion and interoceptive accuracy. And this idea really goes back to the notions of William James, where emotional feeling states are said to arise from the sensing of bodily sensations. So emotional states inform the feeling states of how you feel. And studies which have looked at both emotion processing at the same time as bodily processing, or cardiac processing specifically, have shown that if you do a conjunction analysis between both emotion processing and interoceptive processing and see which areas are commonly activated, you again get this insular region, which supports the idea that the sensing of these internal bodily changes is what gives rise to our emotional feeling states. Studies in the lab have looked at individual differences in interoceptive accuracy and how that might map onto individual differences in emotion processing. So these tests have typically looked at whether people are accurate or inaccurate at these tasks, and then also given them emotional stimuli such as films designed to elicit amusement, fear, and anger. They've got people to rate how intense, emotionally intense they find these films, and they're able to show that those individuals with good interoceptive accuracy rate the films as more intense. Again, consistent with the idea that the better able you are to detect these signals, the more they give rise to emotional feeling states. Understanding this bodily basis to emotion has the potential to be informative for different conditions with impairments or alterations in emotion processing. And a lot of my work at the moment works with individuals with autism spectrum conditions. And so these individuals have a diagnosis of autism, which is a clinical condition where they have alterations in emotion recognition in self and other. Interestingly, anxiety is really, really comorbid in this population. And these rates are so high. So in the literature, it says 23 to 60% of individuals who are autistic also have an anxiety disorder. In the clinics in Brighton, we're seeing at the upper end of that, if not higher. So I would say 60% or more of autistic adults who are coming through the clinic in Brighton have an anxiety disorder. And what's so interesting about the altered neurocircuitry in autistic individuals is this insular region acts in a very different way. In terms of reactivity, is often overreactive or underreactive. It just has altered activation. But in terms of connectivity, there's this quite consistent finding of reduced connectivity of the insula in autistic individuals. So it's acting much more like an island in autistic individuals. It's not speaking or co-activating with the rest of the brain in autistic individuals. And this is particularly true in terms of its coupling with the somatosensory cortex, and also bilaterally. So this potentially speaks to an impairment in the capacity to sense bodily sensations as a means to inform emotional experience, which our other data suggests. So maybe there's something about altered interoception in these individuals. And I think this is supported by some of the empathy work in autistic individuals. So one of the things that I think very strongly based on clinical observations is that autism has been very much mischaracterized in the past. And I think that is changing now. But historically, there were many accounts saying that autistic individuals lack empathy. And I just don't think that's true. They might not always understand, but that's different from lacking empathy. Psychopaths lack empathy, whereas autistic individuals, if they understand, then often their empathy reactions are actually very high, if not higher. And if you look at the bodily response of individuals who are autistic, watching someone else in pain, they actually have a higher bodily empathy response. So in these autistic individuals, they're looking at pain images in other individuals, and their skin conductance response is actually higher for watching other people in pain relative to healthy controls. And were I to show you all this data, it's not that they just have higher skin conductance response in general, it's specific for these pain stimuli. So they're actually having a heightened bodily empathy response. And this is potentially consistent with the idea that they have impaired interoception. They can't read and use these signals in the same way. Indeed, I would say now that they may be overwhelmed by them. There's not precision into them. So were this a talk exclusively about autism, I would cover data from a number of different perspectives in autistic individuals, which was consistent with this idea that they potentially have a deficit in interoception that underscores a lot of these emotion processing alterations. For example, autistic individuals often have altered eating patterns. They don't necessarily know when they're hungry, so they may forget to eat, or they may just eat and eat and eat something they really like. And that's potentially because they're not getting the cues that they're full up, so they can just be guided by how much they're enjoying something. Intuitive decision-making, again, is impaired in autistic individuals. They'll often say they have this sort of very logical way of approaching stuff. And again, if I was giving a different type of talk, I would present you data that I've done and other people have done, showing how this sort of gut feeling type of intuitive decision-making can really be linked to interoceptive changes in the body, which I did work from a completely different perspective, working in the London Stock Exchange, looking at instinctive decision-making with traders. Very strange experience, but looking at how we can look at these very fast instinctive decision-makings and linking them to cardiac changes. So you can look, so intuitive decision making as well, like it really can be founded on these informative bodily signals, and potentially autistic individuals have to take this more logical approach because they don't have access to these signals in the same way. We know that alexithymia is really high in autistic individuals. I'm going to be talking about that later on, but this impairment in understanding how you feel could be very much linked to interoception. Again, if I was giving a different type of talk, I might talk to you about data, which I think is the most beautiful data of all, which is about how we can represent in our own physiology the emotional states of others. So understanding, so interoception can tell us not just how we feel, but how other people can feel. Because if our hearts race with other people's fear, then we can know how they're feeling through the sensing of our own bodily changes. I see this as a biological basis of empathy. So again, understanding others could also potentially be impaired through this interoceptive route. Temperature, anxiety, internal, external senses, I'll talk about those a little bit later. But again, this is just to really highlight that many of the features of autism could be understood through the changes in these interoceptive processing channels. So first of all, my study in 2016 with my then mentor, Hugo Critchley, was the first study in autistic adults looking at interoception. So we hypothesized that using these very simple cardiac tests, we would see an impairment in interoceptive processing in these autistic individuals. And we, again, just use this very simple one where people count their heartbeats in a specified time frame, or they judge whether tones are in sync or out of sync with their heart. And what we can see in terms of interoceptive accuracy is that not all individuals who are autistic were impaired, but there is this distinct cluster here who are showing a really severe impairment in their capacity to accurately detect when their heart was beating. The fact it wasn't in all participants is very consistent with sensory alterations in autism. Not everyone who's autistic has hyper or hyposensitivity to sound or vision. It's very individual basis. And this just suggests that interoception may be another sense, which may or may not be impaired, but in those individuals who it is impaired in, it can be impaired a lot. And I compared this behavioral accuracy measure to a subjective report measure. So you remember I said that what is so interesting about interoception is it doesn't necessarily map onto how good people think they are. So we looked at this subjective measure where it was just a self-report scale. And I love this. The autistic individuals think they're great. Like they think they're really aware of what's going on in their body. So you get this massive dissociation between this belief and this precision. Just to say that autistic children and adolescents were tested after my study following the same protocol, and they found actually bigger differences, showing that this may be something which changes at an early, or not changes, but is different at an early age between these individuals between 6 to 18. Finally, work by Jeff Bird in Oxford is very much taking the precision position, which I don't disagree with at all, that this may be particularly coupled to alexithymic symptoms. So he would argue it's not all autistic individuals, it's actually alexithymia that's driving it. And I'm okay with that. It's saying that those individuals who are autistic with particular emotion processing alterations, you see this more often. And he's finding alexithymic adults and showing that they have the same interoceptive impairments, which is very consistent with the idea that it's altered and coupled specifically to emotion processing deficits. So again, linking back to these individual difference-based characteristics, rather than just taking a global perspective in different groups, I computed an interoceptive error. Just to go back to my slide, so what I did was I Z-scored both of these values, put them into standardized space, subtracted them, and now what this gives you is a measure of how good people think they are relative to their actual ability, and you can have an error score, which is the discrepancy between those two things. And using that error score was linked to anxiety. So if people thought they were very good, but actually they weren't, then their anxiety is larger. If their body's doing hyperarousal things, but they didn't have precision into that, then there's greater anxiety. So the hypothesis initially was if we can increase interoceptive accuracy, close that error, then we should be able to reduce anxiety. This is the pilot data that I presented 2 years ago when I first met you guys. So I'm going to present this fast. And then I have to say, I'm going to present you, which I'm a bit nervous to do, the first time ever we've got the we got the results in our clinical trial in autistic individuals. I've presented the preliminary data before, but I've never presented the final data in this clinical trial. So you are getting from me presenting it the world premiere. So again, using these different interoceptive measures, which was just again the tracking and heartbeat discrimination. What we really care about is this one, because this is the hardest. It's an internal external integration task, whereas with just the counting, you could learn your general heart rate and learn to count in a particular sort of pattern. I don't find that so convincing, but if you can judge whether tones are in sync or out of sync with your heart, there's nothing based on that which can be informed by knowing your heart rate, because the rate of the tones is always going to be the same. They're just going to be 300 milliseconds time shifted off. Okay, so you have to have accuracy into that. It's so hard. So that's the measure we care about. And what we did was we did a training protocol where we got people to do exercise as a means to elevate their heart rate. You can then feel it. We then got them to do these simple tests where we gave them feedback about whether they were accurate or inaccurate. And we looked at this over a series of training sessions. And then when and so this way, when they're doing exercise, they're getting interoceptive feedback about what their heart is doing. They're getting extraceptive feedback, because as we're training them, we're saying you're accurate, you're inaccurate, and they're able to learn from the extraceptive feedback and the interoceptive feedback to gain their interoceptive precision. And then when we test them at the end, we don't do any exercise manipulation. It's all at baseline. But what we found is that when they had done exercise, we would extend the training for a while for when their heart rate returned back to baseline and they were able to stay in the interoceptive channel. So they got practice at doing it at baseline, because by the very nature of the heart, it was slowing down. So we made sure our training sessions covered that entire curve, so that when we did it right at the final assessment period, there was no exercise manipulation, but we found that people could just be in an interoceptive channel while at baseline and at rest, just like you are now. So these are the results of this is just a pilot, and this is in healthy controls, but just as proof of principle, the tracking measure increases. We knew it would, that's fine. The discrimination one, which is the internal external integration one, this is D prime for all you people that love signal detection theory. And what we can see is that it's, I mean, there's a lot of variation here, but we are getting a group elevation in this internal external using this very difficult D prime measure. You can see there were chants initially, and then you are getting this elevation. And what we see is a reduction in state anxiety wasn't seen globally in all individuals. Instead, it was coupled specifically to interoceptive improvements. So those individuals who got better at the tracking task and better at the discrimination task had the biggest drop in state anxiety. And in terms of trait anxiety, everyone improved who underwent interoceptive training. And you weren't getting drops in the control group who were just tracked for interoception over time. Oh, I should also say that there were two other things, and this is something that I think I've talked to you guys before about, but I really, really believe it. And I think there's so much scope for us to maybe collaborate more to look at this, because I think this is also really important. As well as interoceptive accuracy, there's two other things that this data suggested are critically important. So it's not just about interoceptive precision. It's also about not worrying. So if you start to feel your heart rate increase, don't worry about it. That's just your heart. It's okay. And we actually now have we've made these little cards for autistic individuals where we talk about how your heart rate changes at different times of the day in response to different stimuli, and we normalize it. And we found that the not worrying part was also predictive of the drops in anxiety, and using a regression analysis, it has an independent contribution. The other part was the attention regulation part. it is not adaptive to be focused on your body all the time. You don't want to do that. You want to be focused on the world. People who are anxious are focused on their body all the time. So what you want to train people to do is focus on your body when you have to, and then the rest of the time, and if you're overly monitoring on your body, flip your attention to the outside world again. So you've got three things you need to do. You need to have precision into your bodily signals. If you have precision, you can also regulate better. You also reduce this error. You need to not worry about those signals. You need to be not overly focused on your body. If you have, they're all make independent contributions. So if you have an intervention that targets all of them, great. Taking it now to the clinical trial. Okay, just checking time. So what we did in this clinical trial, and there's so much data from this, so I'm just going to present the behavioral data, but we have brain data, we have the works. So what we did was we scanned their brains before and after. So there's in 120 autistic individuals. We gave them interoceptive training in the middle, just like I talked to you about. We did exercise, we gave them interoceptive feedback from, well, they got it from the heart from the exercise, we gave them external feedback, accurate and inaccurate, and we monitored the anxiety before and after. We also reduced the amount of training sessions. In our pilot, we used 8, and then we saw that actually people who were healthy actually learned after 4 sessions. So we made it 6 sessions for autistic individuals. Well, that's not too many sessions. We also looked at changes in emotion processing. I'm not going to discuss the emotion stuff. I'm going to focus on anxiety today, but there's lots of data. And then we compared this to an extraceptive training condition. And this is where we train individuals in emotional prosody. So they see faces or words depicting different emotions, and sentences are said in an emotional way. So they're said in an angry way or not an angry way, and they have to learn what emotion is being expressed just in the way the voice sounds. So it's an extraceptive emotional training, as opposed to an interoceptive training. We also looked at changes in anxiety and emotion. First time the data comes. Okay, and I just looked at this data kind of like really recently, so forgive my slowness with it. But basically it's telling you in these autistic individuals, okay, so this is the discrimination part, D prime, so this is in sync, out of sync, using signal detection theory. So we're eliminating bias and just looking at sensitivity. And we can see that in autistic individuals, whoa, these effects are really big. So you can see D prime's wild. So one is like, yeah, so that's really good. So we're finding that individuals are showing who in the AD is what we call our interoceptive training, aligning dimensions of interoceptive experience. That's because they think they're better than they actually are. So we're aligning the levels to reduce the error, increasing the accuracy. So you can see that in our AD interoceptive training, they get much more accurate. In our control group, they do not. This is a tracking one where they just count the heartbeats over a specified time frame. They also hear an improvement. Not perfect. 1 is a perfect score, but that's decent. They are showing an improvement. Wildly, the improvement is actually better for this much harder task. And if anyone has if that could be a point of discussion, this task has been this just counting one has been shown to be much more influenced by beliefs. So potentially something's going on there. We can talk about that. But basically the take-home message is the accuracy improves, and it improves most for this really hard task you can't get around by any other way than increased interoceptive accuracy. I love this. So I shouldn't be so enthusiastic about my own data, but I really love this. So this is the subjective report. So this is using just the body perception questionnaire. How often are you aware of your bodily sensations? How good do you think you are, and how frequently are you aware of your bodily sensations? Wild. So we know that the interoceptive, we know that the group initially, the autistic individuals think they're really good. We saw that initially. And what this is saying is that the better you get at training people, the worse they think they are. Yeah, so it's actually normalizing.
It went out just a little bit. Yeah, it muted just for like 2 seconds when you were giving us the punchline. Could you give us the punchline again, please?
Okay, sorry. So, so it's saying that the better you train people to be accurate who are autistic, the worse they think they are. And this is in line with the fact that they overestimate initially how good they think they are. So actually training them to be accurate actually normalizes that. It brings them back down again. Whereas our control individuals stay high. So actually training on precision decreases how good they think they are. I love that. And now this is the error score. So how good people think they are relative to how good they actually are. And you can see now that you're getting this reduction in error in our autistic training group relative to the control group using both tracking and discrimination measures. Nice. And this is our anxiety measures now. So we are seeing drops at the group level. So this is everyone. And we wouldn't necessarily expect it to happen in everyone, but at the group level, and this is significant. And we're showing a drop 1 week post-intervention, but also 3 months post-intervention. The numbers aren't massive, but they're significant at the group level and they are maintained 3 months after. Now, this is where we classified them as recovered. I think that is a bold term, so I'm not going to want to use it. We used a pre-registered report because this is actually classified as a clinical trial. And as we submitted the clinical trial, we defined recovered in these terms, which was a 6-point drop on the STI questionnaire, and they had to be below 55. That's what we pre-registered our clinical trial using. So I'm going to use the word recovered based on our criteria, but those levels are still quite high, but they're a decent drop. 6 points is a decent drop. And when you look at the percentage recovered using those criteria, that's 30% in our training group, and that holds at 3 months as well. And then to finish off with, this is my final slide, is some quotes from the autistic individuals, because I think in some ways are just as meaningful and so interesting. So one of them said, as the inner channel gets clearer, the outer channel gets more quiet. And this is really important, I think, because autistic individuals who often are overwhelmed by extraceptive sensory experiences, they're often overwhelmed by bright lights and overwhelmed by sounds, that this maybe suggests that sensory processing is like a seesaw. So if you don't have access to what's happening internally, maybe you're just overwhelmed by the outside world. But if you can raise what's happening internally, then maybe you can make a little bit of balance for the sensory processing systems. So I'm really interested in this idea of sensory processing like a seesaw and what that might mean for training for sensory processing alterations. There's a direction I'm really interested to go in. This is the not worrying part and enhanced regulation. When I notice the impacts of anxiety on my body, I'm more aware of them and I'm able to reassure myself that it's just a physical reaction. So that's the not worrying part. And schooling that was so important with our autistic individuals. We gave them cards, they could carry them around with them so they could look at them if they needed to, telling them about not to worry. So it's working. And they also said, I am better at taking deep breaths and trying to slow my breathing and heart rate down rather than letting it spiral. So what this is saying is early access into these bodily signals means you have a better chance at regulating them. If you only become aware of your heart when you're already in a panic attack, you can't calm down then, you're too far gone. But if you can just feel it starting to ramp up through this precision, then you can do what you need to do to calm yourself down while it's easier to do so. And then finally, Someone said, I believe it's increased my awareness of hunger, and as a result, I remember to eat, drink, and go to the toilet. And this maybe speaks to some degree of generalized bodily axes. It's a big debate in the interoception literature, how much cardiac awareness is linked to gastric awareness, linked to respiration awareness. And this is suggesting there may be a link. I think jury's still out there, but certainly just understanding the concept to this individual helped them with other interoceptive sensations and behaviors. So to conclude, interoception is a sensing of internal bodily sensations. It can influence emotion, and interoceptive error is related to anxiety. Interoceptive accuracy is reduced in some individuals, while beliefs are often elevated. And the interoceptive training as a means to align dimensions of interoceptive experience could be a treatment for anxiety. And I believe it should be coupled with other interventions focused on not worrying and attention regulation as well. Finally, I'd like to thank most of all Hugo Pritchley, who I initially was a postdoc in his lab, and now I'm a professor. He's my main collaborator. I'd like to thank Lisa and James, who are postdoc and PhD students on the clinical trial. They worked so hard. Anna Marie Jones, who was a statistician, who did all the analyses for the clinical trial, where we actually sort of basically handed her a lot of the data and she oversaw it with Lisa to make sure it was done properly from a clinical trial perspective. It was not easy to do, very grateful. And just to all my collaborators, science is about doing it together, and I have so many friends that make it so much better. So thank you. And thank you all for listening. I appreciate it a lot.
Sarah, thank you so much. That was such an amazing talk. I know I have about 100 different questions that I want to ask you, but I don't want to be hogging the mic. I know Dawn had a couple of comments and questions within the chat box. Dawn, is there one or two questions from within there that you want to start off with?
First, I just want to start off with Dr. Garfinkel. I am the biggest fan. I don't know if you know this, but my, the folks in my center we've been working with for the longest time, this is like the talk I've been looking forward to all year. I just think you're amazing. Your work is amazing. And just the way you do things is just so impressive to me. So, I'm thinking about maybe I should go get a postdoc with her. This is awesome.
Right.
And yeah, you're just a freaking star. I do have questions and just want to hear how you think about some of the things that, because we've talked a little bit before about how your work is so relevant to so much of what we do here. But we also have a lot of other scientists, so maybe I can hold mine to the end because I'll probably ask you to stick around even for a few minutes after the noon if you're able to.
So I think the mic's open to other CBCHers.
I would love to say a couple of things. First of all, I might rival Dawn in my enthusiasm. And anyway, it was a wonderful talk and a really fascinating results, and it's really honored to hear the world premiere of the clinical trial results. I have a bunch of questions. I'm just going to try to ask one, and maybe this overlaps with something that maybe Dawn and others would be interested in. So we, as you know, are really interested in cardiac patients who might have some enhanced attention to their interoceptive cardiac information. And one of the things we've thought about and even started to do before is to sort of measure and maybe even try to change attentional bias to threatening information of a cardiac nature. And I've thought about this quite a bit, but I continue not really settling on a solution. But you point out that interoception, of course, is a multidimensional construct. And the subjective component of the interoceptive sensibility seems like it might be something that overlaps to some extent with attentional bias to cardiac signals, but it's not the same construct. I'm just wondering if you have thoughts about attentional bias to cardiac information and where that fits in with interoception and how you think of the multidimensional construct.
I really like the fact you're working on attentional bias and hypersensitivity potentially to monitoring threat in the body. Is it a general is it specific to threat, or is it a general trait tendency to be bodily focused? And I wonder if you can also separate that out as well. I think we know so little about attention, and I think of all the interoceptive dimensions, only now are we really starting to look at attention differences in different populations. I would say that of all the interoceptive dimensions, the one that's most consistently associated with anxiety is just a general bodily attentional bias, irrespective of threats. Like it doesn't need to, it's not threat specific, it's just a bodily focus. So I think delineating and separating threats from just general bodily attention could potentially be informative and could potentially be helpful, because it might be scary to them to think they shouldn't be perceiving threats, like if they really want to perceive threats. But just altering attentional bias in general may be a non-threatening, easier way of tapping into that bias. I have no idea, I've just hypothesized, but certainly the bias that we observe is general to all types of bodily processing, and that's strongly coupled with anxiety symptomatology. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does, thank you.
Maybe I can jump in with a quick one. So one of the things that really struck me, and I want to make sure that I have the right take home, because I feel sort of a little bit flooded by all this information and excitement. But I think one of the things that I took away from your talk and this intervention is that it may be the case that whereas our sort of gut feeling says in this shop that maybe we should be trying to direct individuals' attention away from cardiac signals, because we think an acute event like a heart attack sort of, for most everybody, sort of increases our attention to cardiac interoceptive signals. That maybe instead the answer is to help people become really good, or reduce the error in sort of what they think and what they actually are able to do. And in doing so, give them some sort of mastery over that channel, so that they can more accurately move attention away or move attention to as suits the situation.
That's exactly right. I think that is true. Especially if they're so worried about their heart, they might think it's doing things it's not even doing. So I think definitely giving them precision means that it can also get rid of any false beliefs that's driving that my heart might be doing this. However, I think the not worrying part is really important as well, because if they have precision to it and they're like, whoa, now it's definitely different, then they really might spiral off. So I think that's why you need to work on all of them together. The precision, so that false beliefs aren't driving their worry, but when there is cardiac changes, normalizing those cardiac changes and getting them not to worry about them is also important.
So can you tell, in terms of the interoception from like the heartbeat, as an example, like doctors are trained, you can put your hand on someone's chest and you can feel the heart beating. You actually feel the vibrations, there's some appropriate, it's the nerves, it's your exteroception that can feel it. Do we know for sure when people are doing these heartbeat detection tasks, is it like an electrical, could it be that it is actually exteroception that's just so, such a small signal that you don't really notice it? But is that really what people are getting, or is there really some sympathetic, other channel in your autonomic nervous system that people are detecting, or do we know that already?
Yeah, I mean, welcome to the debate in interoception. Okay. So we're working, so I got a paper that my PhD student's doing now, and one that I collaborated on with a previous postdoc in the lab. And other people have done this as well, where you have little figures and people put on the figure where they feel their heart. And there's massive variation, like chest is the most, but you have head, you have arms, you have all over the body. So you can see these clusters of where people feel it. The degree to which you get different places may also be indicative of some degree of extraceptive. Is anything really interoceptive? And certainly, like, you have chest wall reverberation, and that could be in part somatosensory mediated as well. So I think there are differences in where in the body they're feeling it. That's going to influence what pathways and mechanisms underscore it. They're also going to differ as a function of extraceptive somatosensory inputs as well in those regions. So yes, mechanistically, I think it's a hot debate, but then we can also potentially, I also want to sometimes, because I want people to get better, you know, I'm like you, and that's what I love about your center, is that you want people to get better, and that's what you really want. So I feel like there are a lot of people getting lost in these arguments, and that's cool. Like, I'm glad they're talking about that. It's great. Science should be a collection of expertise from all different perspectives. But I feel like what motivates me and what motivates you guys as well, so we want to understand these mechanisms, but our drive is to make people better again. And we can be informed by them, but we also don't need to be distracted by them if we have the information that we need to create interventions that make people better again.
That's a great answer. Partly what was driving my question also was thinking, I know you focus on cardiac, which is a big focus of our center, so that's great. There's other types of physiologic or visceral organ. There's different ones that we think about. One is like for blood pressure, which a lot of us study. There's, doctors are trained, it's an asymptomatic condition unless it's like severely elevated and it's causing hypertensive urgency. But then there's like these studies showing that some patients can detect whether their blood pressure is elevated or not, even when it's not at a severe level. So that was like one thing, like that's not an organ, it's unless you count the circulatory system or something like that. And then the other one that I think a lot of us are thinking about now is like sort of pulmonary issues, like with COVID, for example. There was a sort of clinical finding that the oxygen levels can be quite low and patients are not sensing it. And I don't know if there's any overlap with what people are doing in the field of interoception around that.
Oh, that's so interesting. Thank you also for giving me the clinical context. That's awesome. That's so interesting. I love that you're doing a blood pressure. Like, I know so little about that, but I'm like wildly interested in it. So learning more, I mean, I heard a bit about your work, so I can't comment on that. I think you guys can help lead the way there. I think it's a really understudied mechanism. So I'm glad you're doing it. Regarding respiration, so I did a tiny bit of work on this previously, where not in COVID, but using, and I actually have a preprint that's out at the moment, which was led by Olivia Fall and Steve Fleming, which is beautiful Bayesian hierarchical modeling of respiratory interoception using a filter detection task. Check out the paper. Steve and Liv are brilliant, and I think they've made all the code openly available. And it was based on a filter detection paradigm that I sort of based from the asthma literature, where you hide filters on people's airwaves, and you can look at the accuracy with which they can detect the presence of filters. So if you put filters on people's airways, and there's as experimenters standing behind them, so they can't see the filters, and they have to judge whether there are filters, no filters. You can adjust the amount of filters, you can see where their threshold is for detecting them, and all they can feel is a mild resistance to their airflow. And people really differ in their capacity to accurately do this. I find that this filter detection threshold is also linked to anxiety. So if your airwaves are mildly obscured, but you don't know they're obscured, then you have higher anxiety. So just on a trait basis, those individuals with better precision into this capacity have lower anxiety. And again, I think this is potentially linked to sort of, error. We can talk about that anyway. But basically, there is this measure, and it seems to be linked to anxiety symptomatology. You can use this with COVID patients and long COVID. And I'm guessing there may be something, again, in terms of a generalized story about a lack of precision into these signals and links to anxiety symptomatology. And it seems to hold for respiration as well. Respiration accuracy, we did not find to be linked to cardiac accuracy, suggesting it's potentially a separate axis. We didn't test that many people. It was only 40 people, but we did find a relationship on the metacognitive level. So if people have good insight into how good they are at cardiac accuracy, they have good insight into respiration accuracy. So the metacognitive insight measure crosses the axis, but the cardiac measure doesn't. I think more work needs to be done on that, but I can't even remember your question now. But was there something else?
No, that was exactly what I was looking for discussion on. Thank you.
Cool. Well, yeah, check out, if you need any of these links to papers, I'll gladly send them to you.
I thought Talia had some.
Yeah.
Was I supposed to talk my comment? Sorry.
If you'd like to, Talia.
Sure. All I had said is when you were talking about anxiety being linked to people not realizing that their airway is becoming constricted, it seems like you know something's wrong, but you're not really sure why. And I've always figured that when people don't know why they're feeling something, they look for reasons, and that makes them anxious, like looking for something else to focus on.
Yeah, and at some level, I think our cardiac patients sort of are more sensitive to these cardiac signals, and then maybe begin that search, and then sort of immediately go to kind of the worst case scenarios. Sarah, I noticed the sort of parallels with alexithymia that you were kind of laying out in your talk. And I'm interested in alexithymia, and I'm also interested in the sort of other end of the spectrum. I wonder how your intervention might influence alexithymia. I'm also really interested in how it might influence emotion regulation more broadly. If this notion that we sort of have a better sense of our bodies and what our bodies normally do, and that we have some control over them, and yeah, the second part of that question is I tend to sort of default to Lisa Feldman Barrett's model, but should I do that? Should I focus elsewhere? Those are my two questions, and I'll stop.
So great questions. And this is where I can't quite remember the final data. I think we also find a significant drop in alexithymia. I think we do, but I can follow up and check that. But I think that does happen. Certainly, I've looked at the scatterplot data in half the sample where we were allowed to do interim analyses, and there were definitely a lot of people who dropped their alexithymia. So even if it's not significant on the group level, we are seeing shifts in alexithymia using the Toronto alexithymia scale. Whether we believe that scale or not, mapping onto alexithymia is a debate, but certainly, I think it does sound like there is an alleviation to some extent. Regarding the regulation, I think that needs to be looked at systematically and empirically, but certainly from the testimonials that we got from autistic adults, absolutely it helped them regulate. They really felt it. They felt like they could suddenly feel from an early point, they were starting to get anxious, and then they could do what they needed to calm themselves down. Absolutely. So I think we need to do that systematically to really pull it out and demonstrate it clearly, but the testimonials suggest it's a regulation route that really makes a strong difference. Then regarding the Lisa Feldman Barrett and the slightly more theoretical approach, the degree to which these map onto these, I think they're consistent. I think I just like very simple terms. So I just like unaccounted for arousal. I like precision or accuracy. And I don't know that we need to take it anywhere else. So I'm sure it is consistent, and I'm sure she brings a sort of brilliant perspective. But I do shy admitting this. I feel like I can explain it in ways that make more sense to me. And I can sometimes get a bit lost when it gets a bit too theoretical heavy, when I just can have a little arrow. But I don't know. Yeah, I guess that's how I would answer it, giving my honest truth.
Do you mind if I ask one more question, Sarah?
Yeah. Oh, no, I don't mind.
This is some of our interventions that people are working on for the Roybal Center. Some people are including a component of mindfulness training. Like, it's not a full MBSR type of thing, but it's being incorporated into, for a couple people, it's being incorporated into the CBT. And the other piece we've been talking about is some psychoeducation. So the first question is quicker. Is you're in trial with the autistic patients, did you explicitly do some psychoeducation or even something more intensive around like not worrying, and or was that just something that happened organically on its own? And then the second question was, do you know if there's evidence of that mindfulness training leads to better discrimination or accuracy?
So mindfulness, yeah, and this is mindfulness. I'm going to switch them around. So mindfulness does not increase cardiac interoceptive accuracy. I want to make that really clear. There's been a few studies that have shown that. There's so much is being published in this literature that there could be studies to the contrary, but the studies I know about are very convincing to suggest that cardiac accuracy does not change with mindfulness. Indeed, I wonder sometimes if mindfulness could be a little problematic from an accuracy perspective, because I think it might make you think you're a body person. Oh, I'm really accurate. So it might even elevate this belief part. So I think mindfulness is wonderful from the not worrying, just noticing perspective. So I think mindfulness, if it is having an effect to alleviate anxiety, it's through that route. And so we took inspiration from mindfulness. We didn't do anything systematic. Again, I just wanted something really simple. So we just made up these cards. Your heart rate changes over the day. This is normal. Don't worry about it. Like, it was, I can show you the cards. They're very simple. They're to be accessible with people with autism. So they're using simple language. And so I think mindfulness works through that route. And that's why I think mindfulness coupled with some sort of accuracy training and precision would hit both routes. First part of the other part of the question, or was I'm so sorry, I'm being so forgetful now.
I think you kind of answered them both together. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that was great.
Cool.
I know we're kind of past the hour. I'm guessing some of us may want to follow up with you separately, and our schedules are busy and the holidays are coming up, but you probably hear more from us in the weeks ahead.
I hope so. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And we're going to have a Roybal retreat coming up, so I think you're going to hear about some of the ideas that our people are having, and we'll love it. That'll be a good chance to get your input on what we're doing. Andrea Duran is still in the middle of like designing her study, and I think there's some opportunities to more explicitly incorporate some of the ideas from today. Andrea, we'll talk later. But yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. Good luck dealing with the COVID season, and we're just so lucky and happy to have you part of our center as an advisor. And hoping for lots of opportunities to collaborate together.
I would love that. As I said, I'm massive fans of what you're doing and how you're trying to help people, and I really would love to be more involved with you as a centre. So please get in touch, and I look forward to more opportunities to speak and collaborate.
Thank you,
Sarah. Amazing talk. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye, everybody. Stay tuned.